Welcome back. Thanks for joining me in another episode in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. Today's text, we're going to be focusing on Matthew chapter 7 in verses 13 and 14. So let's read the passage. Jesus says, "Enter in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leads to life, and few there be that find it." In this sermon, Jesus is not just offering commentary on the law of Moses. He's not just another rabbi giving his opinion about how the old law was to be interpreted. Nor is this just criticism of the religious establishment of his day. In this sermon, Jesus is teaching the gospel of the kingdom, and he is spurring his audience to action. And we certainly get a sense of that as we begin here in verse 13 through the rest of what Jesus says in the sermon. This represents the conclusion to his sermon. And conclusions are important because a speaker will tell his audience what he wants them to do with his message. And what becomes eminently clear at this point of the sermon is that Jesus sees us as having a choice to make. We're going to have to choose what we're going to do with his sermon. What are we going to do about the gospel of the kingdom in our lives? We have to make a choice. Making decisions in our lives are often very difficult and sometimes complicated. Sometimes it becomes unclear to us what the right choice is to make, and there are consequences for all the decisions we would make. Jesus here, though, he narrows our focus down very clearly. He says that we have two options. We can choose the wide path in life, or we can choose a narrow path in life. But choose we must. These are two very different paths, very different roads that lead to very different lifestyles and to very different destinations. But choose we must. So what can we learn and understand about these two different roads here, and why there's such difficulty that we might have in trying to choose a path in life? Why is it that so many people, Jesus says, choose the broad path, and in just a few choose the narrow path? Why is there difficulty in making a wise and right choice? Well, perhaps some of this is related to the fact of the temptation that the wide path brings with it. There's a temptation that the wide path brings in making choosing the narrow path difficult. In some of Jesus' teaching, he would often talk about the challenges that we have in coming to the kingdom, and in what is going to be involved in us getting to the kingdom. For example, in Matthew chapter 19, in a very similar way, Jesus says that it's only with difficulty that a rich person will enter the kingdom of heaven. And to make an illustration to that point, he says that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, what is Jesus getting at there? Is he biased against the rich? Well, of course not. He's just acknowledging certain challenges that are particular to those who are rich, those who have lots of possessions, who place their trust in those possessions, who find fulfillment in those things. Jesus says it's going to be very difficult for a rich person to put his trust and hope in something altogether different. That this rich person is going to have to make sacrifices of those things. And that's true in making the right choice of these two roads. The narrow road is going to demand that we make personal sacrifices. Mainly, we're going to have to sacrifice self. We're going to have to sacrifice sin. In Hebrews chapter 12, for example, in verse 1, the Bible tells us that we're to lay aside every weight and sin that besets us, and so that we can run the race that is set before us with endurance. So there's sin and selfishness gets in the way of us getting on the narrow road. The broad way requires nothing of us. We can bring all of our sin and selfishness, and we don't have to give up any of that. And that sounds appealing to a lot of people. It's easy. It requires nothing of us. The broad path also is popular. Jesus says that many people choose the broad path. And that becomes very, very appealing to us, mainly because we tend to find security in large groups. If we're in a large group of people, we take comfort in that. If we think like a lot of people, if we've come to similar conclusions, if we hold similar opinions and views about a subject, as do many other people, then we're reassured that our thinking must be right, because so many other people think like we do. There's danger in that. There's danger in that. We can get a false sense. The broad path gives us a false sense of security because of the fact it's popular. Well, who's on the narrow road? Who chooses such a path as the narrow path that leads to life? Well, if we take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, we will find answers to that question. For example, the poor in spirit are on the narrow road. People who have finally come to acknowledge their sinfulness and their dire need for Jesus in their life. Those are the kinds of people who are on the narrow road. Those who are meek. Those who are yielding themselves into submission to Jesus and the message that He brought. Secondly, we'll find faith on the narrow road. Those who are giving up sin, who are giving up selfishness, who are tearing down their idols, are learning to trust in the preacher of this sermon. They're learning to place their trust and confidence in Jesus. They're learning to rely upon Him as they face difficulties in their lives. And people who are willing to believe Jesus and to trust in the bright and hopeful future that He and His kingdom promises. And then lastly, on the narrow road, we will find help. Yes, Jesus says that there aren't many people on the narrow road, but there are some. There are a few. There are a few people who have come to a place where they're acknowledging their sinfulness. There are a few people that we'll find who are placing their confidence and hope and trust in Jesus. And we can find encouragement in that. Traveling the narrow road can be difficult. It's not easy to resist temptation. It's not easy to give up selfishness. Sometimes we can become tired on this narrow road, and that we can be tempted to lay down and to give up. Thankfully, we can find strength and comfort through other people who've made similar choices as we have. We don't have to travel this road alone. We have help of other citizens of God's kingdom. We have help from other people who are part of the kingdom, fellow Christians, fellow travelers who are traveling through this life in faith, in the hopes of eternal life. Well, yes, these two roads are very different, and they lead to very different destinations. Jesus warns that the broad path ultimately, in spite of its easiness, in spite of its popularity, it leads to destruction. While the narrow road, while it will require everything of us, and it's demanding, it leads to life. It leads to life. We can experience this life presently as we learn to live as God originally intended us to live, reflecting His glory. The life of someone traveling on the narrow road is a good life. But this road leads more than just to tranquility in this life. It leads to the hope of eternal life in God's kingdom. So, two very different roads, two very different destinations. We must choose wisely. And I hope that we will give consideration to this sermon and how we are choosing to go through this life, where we're headed toward heaven or toward destruction. Well, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to being back with you next time as we'll continue to study as Jesus describes a particular hindrance to us making a proper choice with regards to His message. Thank you, and have a nice day.